Subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the records, subject to the length limitation and rules. I'd like to begin my remarks by offering my sincere condolences to those who recently lost loved ones and sustained property damage in Sri Lanka and across South Asia due to Cyclone Roanu. I wish for a speedy recovery for the Sri Lankan people and hope our newly invigorated development relationship that we're going to discuss today can help meet some of the challenges left in the wake of the storm. Sri Lanka's lengthy and torturous civil war between the majority Sinhalese and the minority Tamils of the north and east ended in 2009, but the country remains challenged by deep divisions. Sri Lanka's prior leader, President Rajapaksa, steered the country in an authoritarian direction, which included allegations of pervasive human rights abuses, rampant corruption, and the failure to follow the rule of law. In 2015, the Sri Lankan people chose a new path with the election of President Sirisena and Prime Minister Wickremesinghe. There's an opportunity for a new era of democratic reforms and enhanced U.S.-Sri Lankan relations. Relations between the U.S. and Sri Lanka under the Rajapaksa government were often strained due in part to human rights concerns and the treatment of the minority Tamil population. We're optimistic that the Sirisena-led government, which is committed to change and already begun implementing important reforms. In 2015, the Sri Lankan Parliament passed its 19th constitutional amendment to strengthen democratic governance, and the government co-sponsored a UN Civil Rights Council resolution addressing atrocities committed during the Civil War. However, the Sirisena government now appears reluctant to allow foreign judges and prosecutors to participate in the war crimes investigations as called for in the UN resolution. President Sirisena has the difficult task of maintaining the government unity that is needed to pass constitutional reforms. He has found himself between a rock and a hard place, and any moves favored by one element of Sri Lanka's political puzzle could alienate another, potentially undermining his political support and breaking the fragile consensus that makes reform even possible. In light of this challenge, late last year, Secretary Kerry announced a U.S. assistance commitment of $40 million to support comprehensive reforms in Sri Lanka, which the administration hopes will have a significant effect on the trajectory of Sri Lanka's democratic reform and reconciliation process. Closer U.S.-Sri Lankan ties founded in democratic values will facilitate a stronger foundation that will serve as a solid basis for broader cooperation in the Indian Ocean region as well. Under the Rajapaksa, I apologize, I should have a better handle on that name, leadership, human rights became a wedge issue for the United States and Sri Lanka, weakening the relationship, and in response, Sri Lanka turned to China for support. China considers to assert considerable influence, funding development projects in Sri Lanka, including the Colombo Port City project, a $1.4 billion infrastructure project almost entirely funded by Chinese foreign direct investment. The port is strategically located along the busiest commercial sea lane in the world and will be a key part of China's One Belt, One Road maritime Silk Road vision to expand its influence by investing in infrastructure along the trade and energy routes that transit the Indian Ocean. China's regional investments are difficult for small nations like Sri Lanka to pass up. These offers are easy to accept as they do not come with commitments to reform in any way. Through our increased development commitment and diplomatic ties, the United States is recognizing Sri Lanka's geopolitical significance to the region, and I do support this elevated cooperation. President Sirisena has shown a willingness to work more closely with the United States, and in February of this year, our nations began the annual U.S.-Sri Lanka Partner Dialogue, bringing new opportunities for the bilateral relationship. And I look forward to our panel of experts suggesting ways in which we might enhance the U.S.-Sri Lankan relationship to our mutual benefit. I also hope they will share insights on Sri Lanka's delicate politics and make recommendations for the future of U.S.-Sri Lankan relations. There is a heightened sense of optimism surrounding the Sri Lanka's recent changes, and I look forward to today's hearing to discuss ways we can prioritize those efforts. And I'd like to turn now to Mr. Sherman for any statements he might have.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing, and I join with you in concern about China's expansion into the Indian Ocean, and especially in Pakistani and Sri Lankan ports. First, I want to express my sympathy and condolences for all those in Sri Lanka impacted by the flooding associated by Cyclone Roanu. I hope that the hundreds of thousands of people who were displaced can return to their homes and rebuild soon. I'm looking forward to those whose loved ones are missing, hopefully being reunited with them. Last year, Sri Lanka saw some positive developments. I expect there's near universal approval among the subcommittee members for the election of Sri Lankan President Sirensena, and the reaffirmation of the decision in the parliamentary elections later in the year. The elections brought to an end the previous government, which had become increasingly intolerant. These elections represented a true success for the democratic spirit. The new president deserves recognition for reducing the power of the presidency. I look forward one day to complimenting an American president for scaling back the expansion of the imperial presidency here in the United States. But returning to Sri Lanka, the new president there has scaled back the powers of the presidency, creating more space for dissent and free expression, and opening the country to greater scrutiny by international human rights organizations. These are notable steps. It's never easy to heal a civil war. The current government came in with a set of promises that impressed the world. Sri Lanka's co-sponsorship in October 2015 of the UN Human Rights Council resolution recommending concrete steps toward true political reconciliation was truly and widely acclaimed. There were promises of the return of land seized during the conflict, of accountability with international oversight for those who committed crimes, of constitutional reforms to move power to regions, and of changes in the security sector that would end a culture that promoted abuse with impunity. Last month, I met with the Sri Lankan ambassador and encouraged Sri Lanka to move forward with plans to continue political reconciliation. The ambassador described a decline in the military's role and in its presence in the north and east of the country, and the Constitutional Council's work toward giving more power to local officials. But I've heard from others, particularly from Tamil groups, that the political process of reconciliation and security sector reform are not moving forward nearly as quickly as they should. It's encouraging that government has established an Office of Missing Persons, but we have yet to see how it can operate independently from the government, how it will be resourced, and how effective it will be. The government has promised to reduce the role of the military, but the defense budget has actually grown from $1.2 billion in 2009, which is when the conflict ended, to a new higher level of $2.13 billion in 2016. The government has declared that it will resettle all those displaced in the war by the end of this year, yet it has not returned the vast majority of land seized during the conflict. It is deeply disturbing to learn that both the President and Prime Minister of Sri Lanka have declared their intention to pursue a truth and reconciliation mechanism devoid of international judges. The Tamil population is unlikely to accept this as impartial justice. Most critical is the issue of the return of government-seized land. The slow progress on this front represents not only a burden on tens of thousands of those who have been displaced, many of whom remain homeless, but also a major barrier to building trust between the peoples of North and East Sri Lanka with the central government. This is a tenuous moment. There is still a sense of optimism, but the government can no longer just rest on the sense of optimism that came with its election. I look forward to the witnesses' assessment of these processes, and especially for direction on what the United States can do to advance full reconciliation between the Ceylonese and the Tamils with due respect for human rights and accountability. Sri Lanka has traditionally been one of the most advanced and prosperous nations in South Asia, and I look forward to it also being a beacon of human rights as well, and I yield back.
Thank you. Just want to advise the committee members and the panelists, there's a good likelihood that we're going to be called for floor votes anytime in the next few minutes. So there are other members that like to make opening statements, so there's a real good possibility we may end up having to do that and then come back. So I'll apologize to the witnesses ahead of time. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this hearing. Thank the witnesses for being here. As a former chair of this committee, I've taken a particular interest in Sri Lanka and have visited there and been in the Northeast and saw the burned out buildings and a lot of the damage and things which have been caused by a lot of years of war and a lot of lives destroyed. And just yesterday, Sri Lanka acknowledged approximately 65,000 people missing during the 26 years of the off and on civil war. But now, 6 years after the official end of the Civil War, there may be a real opportunity to reconcile the people of Sri Lanka and rebuild this really beautiful country. So I hope that they're successful. However, I do remain somewhat weary, although Sri Lanka is in the midst of early signs of actually attaining a sustainable peace and democracy. The scars of the Civil War still remain, and recently it was somewhat alarming when the President Sirisena vowed to eradicate the LTTE ideologies both locally and internationally. And I think this kind of rhetoric can be counterproductive, but also damaging to the long-term prospects for national reconciliation, which is absolutely critical. So I know these are exceptionally complex issues. I thank you and commend you for holding the hearing, and yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Meng.
Thank you, Chairman Salmon and Ranking Member Sherman, as well as all of our distinguished guests for coming to testify here today. I especially love to see a professor from City University of New York on our panel. We continue to express our condolences to so many of the people and their families who have been affected by the landslides, and our thoughts and prayers continue to be with them. The election of President Sirisena in January 2015 brought the promise of a wide variety of reforms and a more inclusive government that would protect the interests of all Sri Lankans, regardless of ethnic and religious affiliations. The United States has a strong interest in ensuring that Sri Lanka remains committed to these reforms, and we have certainly deepened our engagement with Sri Lanka in anticipation that a Sirisena government will follow through with these promises. Sri Lanka has certainly taken some steps to implement a few reforms, but many people, particularly in the minority populations, experience ongoing violence and have been frustrated with the slow reform process that remains extremely vulnerable to political divisions. I look forward to hearing your assessment on the current reform process and challenges. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank Subcommittee Chairman Matt Salmon and Ranking Member Brad Sherman, along with their staffs, for holding this hearing. Although I am not a member of this committee, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak here today, because the relationship between the United States and Sri Lanka is important to my district of Staten Island and Western Brooklyn, because I represent the largest population of Sri Lankans in the United States. And welcome, Professor. It's great to have another New Yorker in the room. Many of my constituents are ethnic Tamils and left Sri Lanka during the Civil War that lasted 26 years. They could not have been more relieved when it ended in 2009 and elections were conducted in 2015. These elections in Sri Lanka have provided an opening for change and reforms that have been taking place. However, I'm not sure if the reforms have gone far enough, so U.S. attention and encouragement remains vital. In particular, the reforms needed for reconciliation between Sinhalese and Tamils, Hindus, Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists after a long war have not yet been accomplished. We need security sector reform to reorient the military for peacetime, political reform to provide greater autonomy for regional governments, legal reform for neutrality of the judiciary, and criminalizing terrible abuses such as enforced disappearances, war crimes, and crimes against humanity remain as important tasks for the future. Sri Lanka has made an important commitment in the area of accountability and transactional justice and needs to be held to those commitments in the areas of truth-telling, justice, reparations, and institutional reforms so that reconciliation can take place. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and reporting back to my constituents, and I yield back the remainder of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We're proud to be joined today by an esteemed group of panelists. First, Ms. Lisa Curtis, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome. Ms. Cara Aber, partner at Armitage International, and Dr. Nimi Gnanan. Did I say that right? Close enough for government work anyway? A visiting professor from the city of New York. And we're really thrilled to have you each here today, and we'll start with Ms. Curtis.
Thank you, Chairman Salmon.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sherman, the rest of the distinguished members of the subcommittee for inviting me here today to talk about U.S.-Sri Lankan relations. I will summarize my written testimony and ask that my full written testimony is submitted for the Congressional record. Let me join the voices of the members of the panel to express my sympathy for the victims of the severe flooding and landslides that struck Sri Lanka last month. My thoughts and prayers go out to the families of those who lost their lives as well as those who lost homes and other property. There has been a rapid turnaround in U.S.-Sri Lankan relations in the past 18 months since President Maithripala Sirisena took power. The passage of the 19th Amendment that curbed the powers of the presidency just a little over a year ago was a milestone on the path back to democracy. Indeed, the democratic reform process is enabling our countries to improve relations. And Sri Lanka continues to be important for its geographic position at the maritime crossroads of Asia and the Middle East. The results of the parliamentary elections that were held in August 2015 further raised hopes that the country would continue down a path of reform and reconciliation. Sirisena cooperated with the United National Party in elections that brought Ranil Wickremesinghe to power as the new prime minister, and the two sides formed a unity government. In a major departure from the former Rajapaksa government's triumphalist attitude toward the 2009 defeat of the LTTE, the unity government in September 2015 co-sponsored a UN Human Rights Council resolution acknowledging that war crimes were committed by both the government and LTTE insurgents during the Civil War. In addition to lifting curbs on the media, opening travel to the northern parts of the country, this Sri Lankan government has also welcomed international human rights organizations to the country, a practice that the previous government shunned. The cabinet also recently approved the establishment of an Office of Missing Persons, although some members of the Sri Lankan civil society have complained that they were not consulted about the move. The government has vowed to adopt a new constitution that abolishes the executive presidency, adopts electoral reform, and strengthens provincial devolution. Despite all of these positive steps, there remains concerns within the Tamil activist community that the human rights reform process is beginning to stall. One contentious issue is whether there will be foreign judges on the panel to investigate human rights abuses. There's tremendous resistance from the majority Sinhalese nationalists who still hold a large chunk of parliamentary seats to the idea of international judges determining the fate of Sri Lankan military officials. Tamil human rights activists question whether the U.S. is overestimating the level of change at the grassroots level or giving too much credit to the government when there are still major human rights concerns among the Tamil people. Let me say a few brief words about China and India and Sri Lanka's relationships with these two key countries. There had been criticism of the Rajapaksa government's cozying up to China and questions surrounding large-scale infrastructure projects that were pursued during his tenure. Sri Lanka's willingness under the Rajapaksa regime to allow Chinese submarines to dock at Colombo's ports twice in late 2014 alarmed Indian officials who were wary of China's increasing influence in its backyard. Sri Lanka has since toned down its relationship with China. However, China will continue to factor largely in Sri Lanka's economic future, as Prime Minister Wickremesinghe's recent visit to Beijing demonstrated. Sri Lanka needs Chinese infrastructure investment, and now that the country is facing a financial crunch, it cannot afford to alienate China, to which it owes $8 billion in debt. So moving forward, the U.S. should encourage the democratic reform process that's underway, encourage more speedy movement toward reconciliation and transitional justice. It should build broader economic and investment ties with Sri Lanka and assist with the revitalization, the economic revitalization of the war-torn areas of the North and East. Without economic and job opportunities, it will be difficult to sustain support for peace and reconciliation. Lastly, the U.S. should focus on enhancing maritime cooperation with Sri Lanka, recognizing the pivotal position that Colombo occupies in the Indian Ocean region. So in conclusion, there is a unique opportunity to move forward with ethnic reconciliation and to unify the country following nearly 3 decades of civil war. And I think the unity government deserves credit for its implementation of democratic reforms, but there is still a great deal of work to be done in promoting ethnic reconciliation and a durable peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Pugh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Sherman and the other esteemed members of this committee. I'd like to express my appreciation for your willingness to have me appear here to talk about the future of Sri Lanka. I've followed it for some time, and I'm very grateful for the attention it's getting now. I, too, would like to express my condolences to the Sri Lankan people during the cyclone that hit several months ago. I was there at the time, and it was devastating to see the harm that was done to the people and their property. And but I was very proud, too, that the United States came forward with additional aid that could help the people who suffered from those storms. So very happy to see that happen. I had been asked to talk about U.S.-Sri Lanka relations, and over the last 15 years, there's been an ebb and flow in terms of our engagement there. With the election of President Sirisena and Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, there really is a new opportunity for engagement. They came into power with a platform of good governance and reconciliation, and together with that, they came in with the desire to rebalance Sri Lanka's foreign policy. What that did was open the door for the United States to engage in a wide range of opportunities for support in Sri Lanka's efforts to finally set the stage for lasting peace. And it also allowed us to regain our partnership with Sri Lanka on key issues. For its part, the government of Sri Lanka has put forth what anyone would consider a very ambitious agenda. I look at it in terms of 5 pillars. There are ideas about constitutional reform, economic stabilization, addressing the painful war legacy, rebuilding democratic institutions, and reestablishing rule of law. In many ways, they've made great progress in the 15, 16 months since they've been in power. Importantly, they've undertaken 2 ambitious efforts. One is constitutional reform, where they're looking to redraft the Constitution, have that presented to Parliament at the end of the year, and then thereafter follow it with a referendum. The other, and perhaps more important, was Sri Lanka's agreement at the UN Human Rights Council meeting to agree to the resolution on reconciliation and transitional justice. That, I believe, is a historic event, particularly given the history of the Rajapaksa regime. The other thing I'd like to note on the government of Sri Lanka's part is the tone it has taken with regard to ethnic issues and how different that is from the Rajapaksa regime. I know some of what they're doing is very symbolic, but it has been meaningful to people in Sri Lanka. The national anthem, for example, on Independence Day being sung in Tamil was a very big deal to many Tamils. I met with Chief Justice Wigneswaran, and he was very moved by that fact. On Remembrance Day, which used to be called Victory Day, they held no parades, and that, I think, was a testament to the Sri Lankan government's intentions with regard to reconciliation. In turn, for all of this, the United States has stepped up its engagement as well. Soon after the elections, they had a number of high-level visits. They developed the idea of a new U.S.-Sri Lankan partnership dialogue. The U.S. was very instrumental at the Human Rights Council meeting. In terms of the resolution, we've increased assistance. $40 million, I believe, is what Secretary Kerry offered during his visit in May of 2015. And we've re-engaged a bit on military-to-military engagement and, of course, are looking at economic opportunities. Having traveled to Sri Lanka at least 4 times in the last 9 months, I did want to offer some caution in the sense that while we're very excited about how U.S.-Sri Lanka relations are going and the direction they're taking, there are clouds in terms of how the Sri Lankan government can move forward. They face a lot of challenges in trying to implement their wide ambitious agenda. The first is that it is very big and it has a lot of moving parts. For Sri Lanka to do everything it wants to do, it's going to take a long and very complicated process to get things done, and I think that's something that everyone needs to realize. They also lack resources and institutional capacity, both in terms of people and in infrastructure. There are people as well within the military, within the bureaucracy, and within political parties that aren't really on board in terms of what this ambitious agenda is about to do. So they do face a lot of controversy there. And on top of it, the new government is part of a very diverse and unique coalition within the Sri Lankan political party. So there's a lot left to be done, and not everyone, as much as Colombo is has gotten down to work and is attempting to address its agenda, having talked to people in the North and East, they are not yet feeling the peace dividend. What I have heard is that a statement that's commonly used is that everything has changed and yet nothing has changed. And so the government has a lot left to do to respond to the needs of the people in the war-affected areas, and that too is a very large challenge and something that we should try to help them with. In all of this, I think the areas that deserve most attention are leadership and confidence-building measures. The Sri Lankan government has a short time frame in which to get a lot done, and people are only going to give it, the people in the war-affected areas in particularly aren't going to give it that much time before their positions start to harden, and frankly, I think they already are starting to harden. And so, in terms of leadership and confidence building, leadership is the idea of greater communication on the part of the Sri Lankan government. In terms of their agenda, I don't think they've done well enough in educating and bringing along all people of Sri Lanka, the people in the south as well as the north and east, in terms of what they are trying to do to respond to everybody's needs, and communication is a big factor. In terms of confidence-building measures, the idea would try to change the mantra in the north and east about everything has changed and nothing has changed. Start making things change a little bit better in terms of focusing on more land release, for example. Lastly, an area that I think the U.S. should look at in greater detail is the idea of a donor conference for development in the north and east. In 2003, after the ceasefire had taken place, the United States was instrumental in bringing together an international coalition in a donor conference in Tokyo where they raised $4.5 billion for a period of 3 years. And that gave people a lot of hope. Now, the rancorous politics in Sri Lanka dashed those hopes, and war returned. But in this instance, where we feel there's a little more hope and a little more opportunity for a lasting peace, I do think it would be wise to consider another type of effort where we could be instrumental in making tangible change happen in the war-affected areas. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gnanan.
Okay. I imagine you all hear a lot of these panels, a lot of these conversations, and I think what comes up over and over again is that there is this disconnect between researchers, between activists, between practitioners and policymakers. And I think one of the biggest disconnects is that policymakers don't understand the ground realities, right? Obviously, it's difficult for policymakers to do. I think, what a lot of my work, what I would like to testify to is how the policies that are made over here affect the people over there. Now, how the people over there experience these policies. If you pass material support for terrorism law in the United States, it affects the resources available to a young girl in the Northeast in Sri Lanka. I think the U.S. policies abroad, and particularly, we're seeing this with Sri Lanka, are too often committed to an ideal, right? And this feels sort of intentional to me, being committed to an ideal. That ideal is usually democracy, right, which is an important ideal to uphold. But this commitment need not challenge political agendas, right? If you uphold only the ideal, then you don't have to shift political agendas. And it is these political agendas by the Sri Lankan government, by the international community, and by the United States that can sometimes sustain and create more conflict, right? So in Sri Lanka, as elsewhere, solutions that are based on ideals are not going to be effective, have not been effective. And this is particularly concerning right now because where a solution fails, violence returns. And that's what I think all of us don't want to see happen in Sri Lanka. So as we consider the progress in Sri Lanka, how do we gauge it? Do we gauge it on policies that reflect an ideal to promote peace? Or do we gauge it on solutions that create structural change that is required to end violence? Right? Which way are we measuring these policies in Sri Lanka? And this is a really central question because the people these policies affect can feel the difference between the two, right? And so there's 4 areas that I want to look at here to examine the gap between the people's experiences and the policies that we're examining. The first is transitional justice, right? People have been talking a lot about transitional justice in Sri Lanka. There was a new report out from a group of local scholars in Sri Lanka, legal scholars, and one of the first requirements for transitional justice is that you address both truth and justice, right? The two have to be done together. And while the question for Sri Lanka is, will the government of Sri Lanka be willing to dig up mass graves to find the missing husband of a widow if that same body becomes evidence for war crimes, right? Will there be truth and justice? The ground reports reveal that already the initiatives that have started, the Office of the Missing Persons, are asking victims to choose between the two. Do they want truth or do they want justice? Another thing that you have to have for transitional justice is confidence-building measures, right? You have to have the confidence of the people. They have to have faith in state institutions. The Tamils and other groups are still feeling very intensely the reverberations of past accountability efforts. The women I met in the refugee camps at the end of the war, they were well aware that there was the United Nations desk to report sexual violence crimes. Nobody went anywhere near that desk for fear of retribution. The people who testified in Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Committee, they immediately faced harassment by security forces. The Office of Missing Persons has already been found to not consult the victims in any sort of genuine process. And a recent survey in the Northeast found that there is a deep disillusionment and mistrust, and this is important not just of the Sri Lankan state, but of the international community. The Tamil population feels that the international community, along with the Sri Lankan government, abandoned them in 2009. Right? So it is important to recognize that there is a deep mistrust and disillusionment in these areas. Another need for transitional justice is the memorialization of the dead. Memorializing their dead in the Northeast has been criminalized. Not just that, they have removed the spaces of worship. Slowly you're seeing the destruction of temples and the erection of Buddhist statues where people might memorialize their dead, right? For many Tamils I've met recently, memory has no value. No? The way that they survive is by forgetting. They don't want to answer any more questions because they fear that memory will put their lives at risk. Right? This is a key problem you're going to face. And you have this sort of moment where you have development and accountability processes merging together. And what you create is this entrenched victimization, where a person exists only by the worst experience that happened to them, where they have access to resources only by articulating the worst thing that's happened to them. Right? And then militarization. Obviously, this demilitarization is one of the biggest issues for all communities in the North and East. To show demilitarization, yes, the government has made the governor of the Northeast a civilian and not a military commander, right? So this is, it is showing something. But if you talk to the civilians there was a civilian I spoke to recently who said, you don't need checkpoints anymore. You don't need soldiers. When you have a context where preschool teachers are recruited into the civilian defense force, where the only jobs are in military-run hotels and hospitals and vegetable shops, and on agricultural farms run by the military, then militarization is complete. Everybody is an informant. For those who have returned home to some of the land that the government has returned, most of them are living in the shadow of military camps. They're still immediately adjacent to the very forces that were a part of the atrocities committed in 2009. The military mediates every aspect of civic life in the North and East. Everything from communal functions to private entrepreneurship. They've even left their mark on the school uniforms of Tamil children. So this type of deep militarization, I think I would caution here, has been used as a model for counterterrorism, has been held up as something we should try to replicate. And I think here it is important to note the defeat of the LTT militarily require the violation of all established human rights and humanitarian norms. I don't think this is something we want to replicate. And women, peace, and security, which is a critical issue now with the UN and here at the US that we put a lot of effort into. A recent survey that I did found that while there has not been as many crimes, the magnitude of crimes against women by the state has decreased, the mode of operating remains the same. So Tamil women still feel that if there is an act of sexual violence, there will be no prosecution for that act. And so I think that what we're looking at, what we have to look at, is what is the potential for the resurgence of violence. We use these words like inequality and alienation, and these are things that cause violence. But we always use them in a passive way. They are actually active things that are happening. They are political acts, right? There is repressive policies that create inequality. There is populations that are alienated, right? It is done through political acts, and these have a political impact. So when we look at Sri Lanka, and we look at political reform right now, what is a genuine political space available for Tamils? If you're going to gauge democratic transition simply by a regime change, right, that shouldn't be how we're gauging it, because you still see the arrest of protest organizers, you still have the Prevention of Terrorism Act in place. A recent report reveals there are still white van abductions, there are still, the use of torture was noted by UN rapporteurs. So have you seen in other countries, like in Myanmar and other countries in democratic transition, the commitment at a national level to a shift in politics, in political dynamics, does not mean there's a structural shift to include the perspectives of marginalized populations. And there has not been a shift in that way. So I would end by saying that the US should have a cautious approach, and the statements and policies should be calibrated by the ground realities. Things like human rights violations, the loss of faith in state institutions, military occupation, a culture of impunity, these are the drivers of violence. You cannot have a sustainable peace without addressing these things. So rather than measuring progress against the ideal of democracy in Sri Lanka, are we willing to push for the dismantling of political structures that hold inequality in place? Thank you.
Thank you. With our truncated time for questions and the fact that we're going to be called for votes very soon, if members could maybe hold their questions to 2 minutes, so anybody that wants to try to get a question in before we leave, I'm going to adjourn when the votes are called. And I'm going to allocate my time to our guest member, Mr. Donovan. So you go ahead and start the questioning, and then I'll go to the ranking member.
I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. I'm curious, why do you think that judicial process is so slow? For over 200 Tamils held under the same laws at this moment, 7 years after the war has ended. Like, why do you believe that this process is so slow for these individuals? Anyone? Yeah.
Well, I can't say for sure exactly why it's so slow, but my understanding is that this is a legacy issue from the Rajapaksa era. There are elements within the government that have been resistant to moving faster on the release of political prisoners. I know, in speaking with the current government, there are efforts to move past that. I know that they've released some prisoners as of last year, and they're looking to release more.
Is it true that some of their names aren't even released yet?
Yes.
The individual, yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
Oh, no, but yes,
Can the United States do anything about this? What's the United States' role here as people back home see?
I would say that one of the key things to look at is the role of, again, the military. You know, a number of the cases, when you have the entrenched military in a number of these areas, the military is mediating everything, right? So whether someone reports a case, what language it's reported in, who they see going into a courtroom, you know, there is sort of an impact on anybody who tries to engage in the judicial process. I've met a former ex-combatant I met last year who said that she has 5 or 6 pending cases against her by the military, right, for things like throwing away her cell phone because she didn't want to be tracked, right? So when the courts are filling up with these types of surveillance cases against all of the Tamils who they suspect to be linked in some way to the Tigers, when women can't walk outside because they have 5 different cases pending against them by the military, there's not going to be room for the Tamil population to address their grievances within the same court system that came from within a state that controlled the entire judicial mechanism that appointed all of the Supreme Court judges. No? So that, I think, that where those two sort of come up against each other, you see this constant sort of slowness of the process.
Right, and so, and this will be my last question, because I want to let the other members speak too. As the chairman said, we have to run a vote momentarily. The United States' role here, besides suggesting, trying to influence, trying to persuade corrections in this system that you've just described that is so wrong, is there a role here for the United States besides just as an advisor of telling people this, what you're doing here is wrong, and the effects on women, as you just spoke about, are something that the United States disapproves of? Just disapproving of it is not going to get this to move any further along in the process. What is our role here?
Well, I think the U.S. Has a role in both the private statements it makes to the government, but also public statements to put a little public pressure. You know, these things are very difficult. You may have parts of the government that want to move forward quickly, but there are the political considerations that they have. So I think they do need our nudging. As I spelled out in my testimony, there have been many positive steps by this government, but the only way the process will continue to move forward is probably from U.S. And other pressure. So I think it is important for us to make public statements, also through the UN. The UN's meeting today on these issues. So I think working through the UN process and continuing to press for concrete and substantive movement, such as releasing political prisoners, it's absolutely necessary for the U.S. to push. Otherwise, the default will be to moving slowly and not taking those very difficult steps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you, Doctor. The government has sped up a special assembly effort to draft a new constitution. It's expected to grant Tamils regional political power. Where do things stand now on drafting these constitutional provisions, and what is the likelihood that Tamils in the north and east will have some degree of regional authority?
The likelihood, I would say, of the devolution of power has always been something that seems very optimistic for the North and East. The concern, I think, becomes who's mediating that political conversation, right? So when you have a context where there was a political movement that was articulating the political demands of the people, right, and that shifts to a political party, right, that may not be as sort of entrenched in the ground realities as you would want, for me the concern becomes how do you get the everyday sort of citizen to engage in politics in a way that their opinions come across without being mediated, right? And so when you see things like mass protests, that is encouraging. Mass protests about the disappeared, mass protests about the missing persons, those are encouraging, but when you see the protesters arrested and harassed right afterwards, then again you feel that that space is not a genuine space offered. It is sort of the streets have opened up and there's less checkpoints, but the people are still
Let me try to
harassed.
squeeze in one more question. What signs are there that the government is really going to transfer land from the military back to the people, and how much land does the military control in the North and East? Ms. Blue, and then
My understanding that, as for the North, there's over 12,000 acres that the military still maintains. Now, I should have prefaced that by the fact that there are a lot of different numbers floating around. That's just the one that I have seen.
let me ask the doctor, is because I've heard a lot about the military-held land. Are we talking here about 12,000 rural acres, or are we talking about more land than that?
They hold a lot more than that, and I think there's private and public land that is being held. And I was there last year for this very sort of fancy military ceremony of releasing tiny plots of land to people. The military still controls a large amount of land in the North and East that should be for, you still have tens of thousands of internally displaced people because their homes are in high security zones, right? So the lands are still being held by the military, and let's say that even where they say formally this is public land, but we're going to use it for a base, we're going to use it for a military hospital, we're going to use it for a military-run hotel, that is still occupation of private lands that belong to Tamils.
I thank the panel members for coming today. We appreciate your commitment to improving the lives of people in the region, and I think we've had a great discussion. I think it's clear that the U.S. Congress is very interested in moving forward, and not just on paper, but in reality. I really appreciate all the comments, and without objection, the hearing will be adjourned.